This is Arise Exchange, Monday, 7th of November. We welcome our viewers here in Nigeria and around the world. I am Bosin Amofai. Let's get the show started this evening. Tanzanian President Samia Suluhu Hassan today appealed to the leaders of the developed economies to make good on their promises to support Africa's quest funding that will ease the continent's transition to clean energy, cut energy poverty, and lift the economy. President Hassan was speaking at the opening plenary of the UN Global Climate Conference, or COP27, holding in Egypt. Let's take a listen.
For livelihood and to save the looming decline of our gross national product, of which agriculture accounts for a greater share. On another hand, inaction means risking our development agenda and prosperity. And thus, in this regard, we in Tanzania has in place the National Climate Change Response Strategy and the National Determined Contributions, which set targets of reducing greenhouse gases emissions economy-wide between 30 to 35% by 2030. With an estimated $19.2 billion as cost of implementation. Now the question is, how on earth the country like Tanzania raise this amount of money for mitigation and adaptation of the climate effects? Nevertheless, showing the political will, Tanzania is continuing to construct and expand rapid transport networks that are expected to reduce more than 900 million tons of carbon generated each year. We are also determined to increase the use of renewable energy sources from 60% in 2015 to 80% in 2025. Tanzania also is committed to preserve 48 million hectares of forest, and this is about 55% of the total land area of the country. And on top of that, we are planting 200 million trees in every 3 years. All we are asking here is for an alignment of global carbon prices to help generate resources from these carbon sinks. Excellencies, this is the type of leadership exhibited by the developing country that lack technological know-how, lacking financial and human capacities, having limited scientific information at our fingertips. Yet with these limitations, our part of the world is asked to choose life or death. The question is, do we have an option? Unless we do it together. And in this regard, we urge developed countries, especially the G20, to fulfill their commitments. We call upon effective implementation of technology transfer while unlocking climate finance to fund our national determined contributions. We are also urging the developed world to raise their subsequent NDC's ambitions to halt greenhouse gas emissions from crossing the irreversible tipping point of atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide. Having said that, Excellencies, I thank you for your kind attention. Thank you very much.
That's Sir Suluhu Hassan, the Tanzanian president, speaking today at the COP27 opening plenary. Leila Johnson Salami is Arise environment correspondent, and she's here with me now on the show to raise the curtain on the 2-week COP27 summit. Evening, Leila. Good to have you.
Good evening, Mr. Wilson. Great to be with you.
Quite a very interesting time. We have this conference on our hand. Is this climate conference taking off as you expected, based on the initial comments of what we heard from Antonio Guterres and a few other big African world leaders?
Yes, I would say so. You know, today and tomorrow, what we're going to see is world leaders giving their initial opening statements that traditionally happen before negotiations kick off, etc. So what we're seeing at the moment is the usual COP process of hearing from world leaders. And so today, for example, we heard from the UN Secretary General, President Hassan of Tanzania. We heard from President Emmanuel Macron, the presidents of the UAE, and the list goes on. So the usual stuff that goes on around COP. But what I would say, one thing that I've noticed that's great because it shows that, you know, things are kicking off immediately, is that today we've seen that the Bezos Earth Fund has pledged $1 billion by 2030 to help to protect carbon reserves and biodiversity. And the UN has also launched an executive action plan for early warning systems that will be led by the UN in partnerships with governments and other partners. Now, this is a 5-year goal to basically ensure that early warning systems are accessible to every single person on Earth. So it's ambitious, but with $3.1 billion to kick it off, that's also quite a lot of funding. So we're seeing that things are already moving, and in Sharm el-Sheikh, there's no wasting time. So it's great.
Do you think, what are the key issues for this conference? What will be different from COP27, 26 in Glasgow last year?
The first thing I would say, Mr. Boasen, is location. So this is an African COP, and also it's the first of 2 COPs to be taking place in North Africa and the Middle East region. The next is going to be in Dubai next year. That's where the next COP is going to be happening, COP28.
Wasn't it to be every 5 years?
COP?
Yes.
No, it's annual. COP itself is annual. Yes. COP itself is annual.
So which one is every 5 years?
I was about to say the World Cup. That's every 4 years.
That's every 4 years.
And let's not go to football now.
That's a World Cup. But again, everything, virtually, it looks like everything that we do on planet Earth increases everything we do increases the rate of emissions. The world is getting hotter than ever before.
Absolutely.
Drought, flooding, and a whole lot of other things. But I was back to that question about Glasgow last year and Egypt this year. What will be different? What are you looking for that will be different?
So the geopolitical context in which COP is taking place this year is certainly different from last year. And that's not to say that the world was in the greatest place this time last year. But since then, we've seen Russia's invasion of Ukraine that has sparked an energy crisis and a food crisis in many parts of the world. We've also seen a spark in US-China tensions following Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. So these are things that are definitely going to shape COP this year, or things that have happened this year that will shape COP this year and make it slightly different from COP last year.
We're talking about climate.
What
has got to do with Russia and Ukraine?
There we go. We're talking about climate, an issue that is not necessarily at the top of the political agenda for many nations now that these issues have also come up. So what we're seeing is that instead of looking at ways to move back from fossil fuel projects, you have countries looking to renew licenses for oil and gas exploration, looking at ways to increase their energy through fossil fuels because of limits on Russian gas now. So these are issues that then tie it back into climate change. It's devastating for many climate activists, environmentalists, and scientists because taking the focus away from climate change at a time where climate change has intensified probably more than ever is a huge risk.
So we've seen more of energy poverty, energy insecurity over the past, since the start of the year, February to be more specific, when Russia went into Ukraine, as well as food insecurity. So you think political leaders, more of the developing countries, so emerging frontier countries in Africa, in Europe, in Asia, in Latin America, will be thinking more of how do we feed our people and how we provide energy rather than thinking about climate change.
That's exactly it. But here's the thing. You cannot ignore climate change, can you? So it's all about finding a way to address climate change while simultaneously being able to address these issues that have now come up. And hopefully COP27 can do that and create that space for negotiation and discussions, because there's been a lot of back and forth, especially in terms of adaptation. You know, the last time I was on a Rise Exchange, we actually covered this topic and how Africa is disappointed at the lack of commitment towards adaptation. And these are commitments or pledges that were made just last year at COP26. So a lot of commitments have already been broken. Developed countries said that they would double finance for climate adaptation by 2025 to bring it onto an even footing with mitigation. But what we've seen so far is that in the past year, hardly anything has been done with regards to developing countries coming forward for climate adaptation finance. So Africa itself, through the Africa Development Bank and the Africa Acceleration Program, has raised, the African Development Bank has brought $12.5 billion forward and is looking for another $12.5 billion to be brought forward by developed countries or richer nations and the largest emitters to reach a $25 billion goal for adaptation on the continent. So we have to wait and see what happens with that and whether these funds can be met, or this target can be met at COP27.
It looks like problems all over the place, and it looks like everyone's got to fend for himself, as it were. But again, you heard President Suluhu says, look, where will Tanzania find such huge billions of dollars? So here is Nigeria talking about 1.5 trillion US dollars in energy transition funding. That's even much bigger than South Africa, I guess. What's your take on that?
It's huge. It's very ambitious. 1.9 trillion, I believe, is required to get to net zero by 2060. But the thing is, it's good that we actually have an energy transition plan. You know, that's step one. Create the plan and have some sort of a plan. How are we going to get to net zero? How is Nigeria going to get to net zero by 2060? I must say this includes $410 billion above projected usual spending, and that translates to about $10 billion annually. So for Nigeria to achieve this, Nigeria is going to have to build strong partnerships at COP27 with the private sector, I must say, because a lot of money is needed. And for this plan to be successful as well, Mr. Boason, it's going to need to be consistent, and it's going to need to serve as a data-driven plan as well. But I must add that beyond looking for funding for Nigeria's energy transition plan, I would like to see Nigeria also looking into debt for nature agreements at COP27. Debt for nature swaps give countries the room to have their foreign debts cancelled or reduced by a creditor in exchange for the debt or making financial commitments.
Debt for climate.
There we go, like the Seychelles have done. So if we can come out with strong agreements for debt for nature as well, I think that would be great, but I don't know if it's on our agenda.
Well, Mr. Vice President talked about climate, debt for climate.
Yes.
Swap, that's what he called it, just a couple of weeks ago. But I'm just wondering, who's taking the lead for Nigeria at COP27? I know for South Africa, I know President Ramaphosa is leading the team, and President Suluhu was also there today, so he's also leading the team for Tanzania. Who's leading Nigeria's team there? Who do you expect? Who should be there?
So the Minister of Environment, Mohamed Abdullahi, is going to be representing President Buhari at COP27 and leading the Nigerian delegation of ministers and negotiators. I believe the Minister of Water Resources, the Minister of Agriculture, and also the Minister of Finance, Power, Humanitarian Affairs and Social Development are also other leaders in Nigeria that are expected to be there at COP27. That's what I know so far. I don't believe that the president is going to be attending, hence the Minister of Environment is supposed to be leading the delegation. He did attend COP26 in Glasgow last year. Unclear as to why he won't be attending this year, but that's what we know. That's what we know so far.
It's on medical leave until the middle of the month.
There we go.
That's what we knew just about a week ago or so. But again, Nigeria hasn't talked about. For South Africa, we've got a couple of, the World Bank and a few others have said, look, we're giving you XY amount of money to support your climate energy transition, which South Africa is talking about. But I haven't heard of any country or any organization, agency say, look, we're giving Nigeria XY amount. So I keep wondering why. Is it because South Africa is Africa's largest emitter, or because we haven't showed the good hands to say, fine, we're going to give you X?
I do think it's a bit of both. South Africa and Egypt are known as the largest emitters on the continent. Nigeria's emissions are quite high on the continent, but not as high as South Africa and Egypt. But at the same time, when money is given, a lot of the time people want to know exactly where that money is going and see some sort of a clear plan of how certain goals will be reached and things will be achieved. And if you can't see that, you're not likely to bring the money forward. However, is that a good enough excuse for such little amounts of funding having come to Nigeria over the years? Most would argue that it probably isn't, because climate change and the effects of climate change are borderless. And the issues that we are facing in Nigeria today off the backdrop of climate change are not necessarily issues that Nigeria has driven and created itself. Obviously, we've contributed to these issues, and there are ways that we can we can look at our own carbon emissions and how to reduce our own greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay, we're going to continue this conversation after the break. Sticking with the biggest summit on earth right now, the COP27 conference in Egypt, and Leila is sticking around as well after this break. We're back, everyone. The UN Climate Conference holding in Egypt right now is the biggest gathering of global leaders, energy companies, policymakers, activists, and others, all of them discussing one of the hottest top story on planet Earth. Our environment correspondent, Leila Johnson-Salami, has been discussing the COP27 summit with me, and joining the conversation now from Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt is NJ Ayuk. He's the executive chairman of the frontline advocacy organization known as the African Energy Chamber. A good evening to you, Ayuk. Thank you so much for joining the conversation from the venue there. Thank you so much for let me start with you on this particular conversation. How is the climate summit taking off? What are the realities on the ground so far?
Thank you so much for having me. The reality of the ground is we started on today very strong. There is a strong global message which basically say we need to have sustainability. There have been some strong message from Western leaders that are saying African countries need to decarbonize. I believe there's nothing to decarbonize. We've seen African leaders put up their position very strong, and that's good. We need to look at African negotiators ensuring that they have that. But there is a global wing that is still saying that the commitments from COP26 in Glasgow have to be met by Africans and have to be met by everybody around the world. So this is not the same hurrah like you felt at COP26 in Glasgow. It is a different COP. It is an African COP, and African issues have to be on the table. And I'm very happy that some African leaders, especially the presidents, are discussing African issues. And heck, they let me in. So, we have to continue pushing and driving African issues. But there is a very deep threat to our hydrocarbon sector, and there's a big movement towards having renewables, but we have to figure out how to pay for that.
Tell me about your meetings with the African presidents and others on the ground there. What are you learning?
I think there is a big division among the African delegations. There's a big division among the presidents. The presidents got the message right. The energy ministers got the message right. But in the negotiations, you have the environmental ministers, whom I think they still need to be schooled. So there's a big disparity among Africans. I mean, you would not imagine that some Africans have been talking about not having the words just energy transition in the negotiating documents, or keeping gas out of the negotiating documents. That is a non-starter. And we have to be very forceful. And we've been very forceful on our position that we need gas, we need a just energy transition. Those two words cannot be there. But we've engaged in a very strong lobby efforts, talking with the presidents who get it. President Macky Sall, very strong, he gets it. President of Mozambique, President of Zimbabwe, they've been very forceful in advocating that, and we are going to stay strong with that. We just need to get the environmental ministers and the African negotiators on board so that we all have a strong African position, a strong African voice, driving up our gas industries. Gas, baby, gas. We're not going to turn our back away from African gas at this time, looking at the energy poverty that we have in the continent right now.
Okay, so UK, we've got the UK former Prime Minister Boris Johnson says the UK does not have the cash, the money to pay for climate reparations. Is that one of those off-the-cuff sound bites you've heard in the last 2 days?
Well, it was something that has been said in private, which a lot of us had known for more than 10 years. It came out public today. They promised $100 billion per year in climate funds. They own $1.3 trillion not being paid. That is not climate reparation, it's climate adaptation. If you want to look at climate reparations, then we're going to have to calculate it and we're going to have to discuss it. What we have to do over the next 2 weeks right here in Sharm el-Sheikh is to ensure that climate adaptation is paid, but also back off our natural gas industries, back off of free market capitalism, back off of our energy industries, and let us do for ourselves what you want to do for us. Africa can make its choices. Africa can make its voices heard. Africans can drive free markets. They can drive gas. They can drive energy. And we need more energy when we have 600 million people without electricity, 900 million without clean cooking, most of them women. So what Boris Johnson said and what Boris Johnson said about climate reparations, that there's no money there. And what Al Gore said about stranded assets, we're more worried about stranded lives in Africa. And we're more worried. Now the truth just came out, but we as Africa have to take our future in our own hands and use this to turn it around and drive up our energy sector to ensure that we do the best for our people. That is our call for now. And this COP this is a battle for the soul of Africa. This is a battle for the hearts of Africa. And we cannot miss this because our people are looking at us and saying we cannot fail at this time. It's gas, it's gas, it's gas. Let's not turn our back on Africa.
Okay, one of the African women who knows what it takes to use gas in cooking is Leila Salami Johnson, and she's live here in the studio with me. She's Arise News Channel's environment correspondent. She's sitting with me tonight on this big conversation. It's way out of my financial markets, by the way. She's got a question for you, NJ.
Lovely to have you on the program. In terms of the outcomes that you would like to see at COP27 overall for Africa, can you walk us through outcomes that you think would be just for Africa at this summit?
Let's go point by point. It's very easy. Number one, back off gas. We want to see climate adaptation and climate adaptation funds paid. Back payment has to come in. One. Number two, we need to open up the market, see real governance. I think governance is very good. We need to put that right on the table and drive that. Number three, we need to look at energy transition, not just energy transition, a just energy transition to ensure that some of the climate finance, African women should have access to those finance. African men should have access to those finance. Sharing of copyrights, patents, and trademarks to get a lot of renewables, whether it's solar or wind products developed, built, transferred, and done in Africa, so young Africans don't have to go to Europe to look for greener pastures. LNG, gas should be used as a transition fuel, whether it is 40 years or 50 years, we move that. But at the same time, we walk hydrogen right in, so some of the gas infrastructure can be used for hydrogen, and we should be able to accept blue hydrogen or green hydrogen. But another point which we would like to see, it's going to have to be massive capacity building and education of Africans about the new economy that goes forward. This is a very balanced view, and that we still have to drive that. But there is still a role for oil in our natural, in our ecosystem, because we still need to be able to drive, clean fuels and really drive that over the next few years before we move. I think Africa actually has a very, very balanced position. We are not raising up coal or saying that we want to use more coal like Europe or the UK is trying to do. We just want a fair and balanced deal. And this is our chance to get that. And we should not leave Sharm el-Sheikh without getting that. We just need to get everybody on board and drive that and make this happen in Africa.
Anje, there were folks who were also protesting at this summit. What are they saying?
Well, you always have extinction rebellions. I think people are protesting and are saying that we should end oil today, we should end fossil fuels today. Let's be very cautious here. You're telling the continent with the lowest greenhouse gas emission, which is somewhere around 2.73%, that we should stop Africa's oil production. That is wrong, that is unfair, and that is unjust. And I think their protest is misplaced. They shouldn't be protesting in Africa. They should look at Germany that has really started coal plants, open up drilling in the North Sea with the UK, or Norway giving 52 oil licenses. They should look at the United States opening up federal lands for drilling, and China, which is one of the biggest polluters. They're not protesting there. It is graciously unfair to be protesting the lowest producers in Africa. They want us to stop the East African crude oil pipeline that is going to produce about 200,000 barrels. And they say if we don't stop that, that will be Armageddon. The world is going in and climate change will become a problem. But you don't forget that Uganda is going to produce 200,000 barrels. That is just 1.8% of what the United States produces. So if this 1.8% is the problem of the world, then we're really in trouble. I think these protests are misplaced. I welcome civil disobedience. I used to protest myself, but let's channel our efforts towards a just energy transition because it could really help everybody. We have so much problems in this continent, and this is our time to shape history to really guide those gods of the African skies to take us there. And we must not lose this. And I'm going to be here. Today was like we took a lot of punches against our industry, but it was kind of like a rope-a-dope. You're going to take some shots, but I'm still standing. And from tomorrow, we're going to be coming back, but we are not going to back down on what we have to do. We will rope-a-dope, but at the end, we are going to win. We're going to get a knockout punch out of Sharm el-Sheikh for Africa. You bet that's going to happen right here.
Okay, thank you so much, NG Ayuk. I'm sure it's a 2-week summit, so there's enough time to get together, disagree, then agree, then disagree and agree, and I'm sure you agree, Leila.
Absolutely. I think there's nothing more important than looking at a just energy transition for the African continent. It's only fair, it's only right, and it's the only way it can happen. You can't go from fossil fuels to nothing overnight, Mr. Bosun.
All right, thank you so much, Leila Salami Johnson, our Rice Environment Correspondent, and NG Ayuk, Executive Chairman at the African Energy Chamber in Sharm el-Sheikh. All the best to both of you.